What if everything you learned about fine dining missed the most important part? Most people think gourmet cuisine is about rarity, about truffles shaved tableside, about caviar harvested from distant seas, about ingredients so scarce that price becomes proof of value. They're not wrong. But they're missing something. Because some of the most celebrated dishes in the world were born in poverty. Lobster was once so abundant in 18th century New England that it washed ashore in piles 2 feet high. In 1820, it was commonly fed to prisoners and indentured servants. Oysters in 19th century New York cost a penny apiece and were sold from street carts to dock workers. In 1930s Naples, pizza was a street food for the urban poor, sold for a few lire to families who couldn't afford meat. Today, lobster can cost $40 per pound. A dozen oysters at a Manhattan restaurant can exceed $60. Artisanal Neapolitan pizza, protected by the Associazione Verace Pizza Napoletana, sells globally as heritage cuisine. So what changed? The usual explanation focuses on taste, or on improved cooking techniques. But it misses the deeper pattern. Across centuries, economic systems have repeatedly transformed cheap survival food into luxury identity markers, not by accident, not by sudden discovery of flavor, but through scarcity engineering, branding, and the power of institutions to redefine value. Let me show you how. Because this isn't a story about food. It's a story about how markets manufacture prestige, and how gourmet is often just poverty, repackaged. The pattern begins in ports, prisons, and factory towns. And it repeats with remarkable precision. In the early 19th century, Boston Harbor was crowded with fishing vessels. By 1825, Massachusetts fishermen were harvesting an estimated 12 million pounds of lobster annually. The crustaceans were so plentiful that they were used as fertilizer and fish bait. Contemporary accounts describe farmers grinding lobster shells into their fields. Prison records from the Maine State Prison in the 1830s show inmates petitioning for fewer lobster meals, claiming they were being fed it 3 to 4 times per week. On the surface, lobster was undesirable because it was common. But think about what this meant in practical terms. If you were a coastal laborer in 1800, protein was scarce. Beef required pasture. Pork required feed. Chickens laid eggs, but did not produce significant meat. Lobster required only a net and access to tidal waters. Its low cost was not about flavor, it was about supply. The same dynamic unfolded in New York City with oysters. By 1840, New York Harbor contained over 350 square miles of oyster beds. The city consumed an estimated 600,000 oysters per day by mid-century. Street vendors, documented in Harper's Weekly Illustrations from 1871, sold oysters raw, stewed, or fried to working-class customers for pennies. Oysters were so central to the urban diet that they were embedded in tavern culture, factory lunches, and dockside commerce. Then industrialization accelerated. Railroads expanded after the 1862 Pacific Railway Act. Refrigerated rail cars emerged in the 1870s. Suddenly, seafood could travel inland. What had once been hyperlocal surplus became a transportable commodity. Follow the chain. Abundance leads to low price. Transportation expands reach. Demand increases, over-harvesting begins. Supply tightens. Price rises. Between 1880 and 1920, New York's oyster beds collapsed due to pollution and over-harvesting. By 1927, the once thriving harbor industry was effectively dead. The same beds that fed millions of working-class residents were biologically exhausted. Scarcity replaced abundance, and scarcity changed perception. The pattern is unmistakable. When access narrows, status rises. But lobster's transformation required another step. In 1842, The Boston and Maine Railroad connected coastal Maine to inland cities. By 1870, canning operations in Eastport and Rockland were shipping preserved lobster nationwide. What had been prison food became accessible to middle-class consumers hundreds of miles from the ocean. Marketing materials from late 19th century canneries emphasized delicacy and coastal freshness. Think about what this meant if you lived in Chicago in 1890. You had never seen the Atlantic. Lobster was no longer common. It was exotic. Exotic becomes prestigious. By 1920, lobster was firmly established on hotel menus catering to urban elites. The Waldorf Astoria in New York listed lobster Newburg as a specialty. A dish that originated from abundance became associated with refinement. This was not a sudden discovery of flavor. It was a shift in context. The same sequence appears again in France. In 1789, during the French Revolution, peasants consumed coarse bread made from rye or barley. White wheat bread was reserved for the wealthy. But foie gras, today synonymous with luxury, originated as a preservation technique practiced in rural households, particularly in southwestern France. Force-feeding geese increased liver size and preserved fat for winter months. It was not haute cuisine, it was survival strategy. Over time, chefs like Marie-Antoine Carême in the early 19th century elevated rustic ingredients into courtly presentation. Institutions such as the emerging restaurant culture of post-revolutionary Paris reframed peasant techniques as aristocratic delicacies. Surface narrative, refined chefs invented luxury. Deeper reality, scarcity, urbanization, and institutional endorsement rebranded rural necessity. The foundation of gourmet transformation rests on three forces. First, resource depletion or geographic constraint creates scarcity. Second, transportation and preservation technologies expand selective access. Third, cultural institutions, restaurants, cookbooks, culinary schools, redefine meaning. Once those three align, value shifts. But here's the key question: who controls those institutions? In 1900, Auguste Escoffier published Le Guide Culinaire. It codified French cuisine and elevated specific ingredients as markers of sophistication. Escoffier worked with César Ritz to build hotel dining rooms into global status symbols. The Ritz Paris opened in 1898. The Savoy Hotel in London, where Escoffier served as head chef in the 1890s, became synonymous with elite dining. Institutions were deciding what counted as fine. Think about what this meant for the average citizen. If Escoffier listed lobster or foie gras as refined, the label stuck. Culinary schools replicated it. Cookbooks echoed it. Hotel menus reinforced it. Value became institutional, and institutions favored scarcity. Meanwhile, industrial workers in Manchester or Pittsburgh were eating inexpensive cuts of meat, root vegetables, and grains. Their food did not lack flavor. It lacked endorsement. So the stage was set. Abundant foods became scarce through ecological or logistical change. Scarcity invited new markets. Institutions conferred prestige. Price followed perception. But this was only the beginning, because in the 20th century, the mechanism became more deliberate and far more profitable. By the early 20th century, refrigeration had moved from rail cars into homes. In 1913, fewer than 1% of American households owned electric refrigerators. By 1940, that number exceeded 44%. After World War II, it surpassed 80%. Cold storage reshaped supply chains. It allowed year-round access to seasonal foods. On the surface, this democratized cuisine. But it also concentrated power. Large distributors such as Swift and Company and Armour and Company, part of the Chicago meatpacking industry, controlled slaughter, processing, and distribution. The United States Department of Agriculture, established in 1862, regulated grading standards. Grading determined which cuts were labeled prime, choice, or select. Think about what that meant. A federal classification could increase price by 50% or more. The difference between choice and prime beef was not just marbling, it was branding backed by authority. The same pattern appeared in Italy with pizza. In 1889, according to widely cited accounts, Queen Margherita of Savoy visited Naples. Chef Raffaele Esposito reportedly prepared a pizza topped with tomatoes, mozzarella, and basil to resemble the Italian flag. Whether embellished or not, the story was later institutionalized. In 1984, the Associazione Verace Pizza Napoletana was founded to certify authentic Neapolitan pizza. Strict guidelines specified flour type, fermentation time, oven temperature, and geographic origin. A street food once sold for survival became protected heritage. Certification limits supply. Limited supply increases value. Value invites global replication. By the early 2000s, artisanal Neapolitan pizzerias appeared in New York, Tokyo, and London, charging $20 to $30 per pie. Meanwhile, mass-produced frozen pizza, introduced in the 1950s by companies like Totino's, sold for a few dollars in supermarkets. Two products, same base ingredients, radically different prices. The difference was institutional endorsement and perceived authenticity. This wasn't accidental. It was systemic. And it would accelerate dramatically in the late 20th century.